The scream that tore through the hallway wasn't a cry for help, it was a mother's grief. Alara froze one gloved hand, still hovering above the crash cart. Alarms wailed from room 317, but inside the monitors had already flatlined. Minutes earlier, the patient, Harold Gauss, media tycoon and donor to half the hospital's wings, had been stable, breathing, recovering. Now he was gone, and Alara, the last nurse on shift, was standing alone in the room. She'd followed protocol, monitored his vitals, even alerted a doctor when she noticed irregularities. But by the time anyone listened, it was too late. The family wanted answers. The hospital board wanted a scapegoat. Alara was suspended before the shift ended. She tried to speak, but her supervisor's stare told her not to, so she didn't. Not even when the media storm began. Not when her neighbors turned cold. Not even when a stranger spat at her in the grocery store. She stayed quiet, even when she could have screamed. But what the cameras would later reveal, what no one was ready to believe, would change everything. And the ending, you won't believe what finally sets her free. Alara used to hum during morning rounds. It was a soft habit barely audible under the buzz of fluorescent lights and beeping monitors, but it brought calm to her and her patients. She used to believe that kindness could be infused into motion, that steady hands and eye contact could carry more weight than words. But the morning after Harold Gauss died, that hum was gone. She sat in the cold metal chair outside the HR office. A sealed manila envelope rested on her lap, her provisional suspension. Her ID badge had already been turned in. Her locker emptied by another nurse. She was still in her scrubs, though she wasn't allowed on the floor anymore. Dr. Keene hadn't even looked at her as he passed. The same man who'd once said she had the kind of judgment you can't teach. Now he barely made eye contact. A week passed in a blur, then another. Calls from reporters rang until she stopped answering. Then came the silence, thick, suffocating. Even her landlord looked uncomfortable when she paid her rent in cash, asking gently, "You, doing okay?" She smiled. "Yes, just taking time off." He nodded, then avoided her completely after that. It wasn't long before she was a headline. Nurse suspended after death of philanthropist Harold Gauss. Questions raised over patient monitoring in ICU. Anonymous staff say Nurse Alara Voss missed warning signs. They never said who the anonymous staff were. They didn't need to. Rumors filled in the gaps that she'd been tired, hungover, distracted, reckless. No one asked her side, because the cameras in room 317 had conveniently lost data during that critical hour. A corrupted file IT had said, "Nothing malicious, just bad luck." But luck had always been cruel in silence. Alara left the city 4 weeks later. Not dramatically. She didn't burn bridges or issue a public statement. She just packed what fit in her car, left the rest, and drove south. No destination, just escape. She spent nights in rest stops, humming again, but this time to fill the silence in her own ears, not anyone else's. Eventually, she landed in a coastal town where the air smelled like salt and pine. It was the kind of place where no one knew her name, and the grocery store still hand-wrote sale signs. She rented a tiny attic room above a bakery. The woman who owned it, May, was 75 and hard of hearing. She offered cheap rent in exchange for help hauling flour sacks. Alara didn't mind. For a while, life slowed to a hush. She helped May knead dough, took long walks by the cliffs, and learned to sleep without dreaming of monitors or code blues. But even in quiet, grief finds a way. One evening, May handed her a newspaper, weeks old, yellowed around the edges. "Thought you might want to see the obituaries," she said, not realizing what she was handing over. Alara's fingers froze. There, third from the bottom, Harold Gauss, 74. A short paragraph. Just the facts. No mention of scandal, no mention of her, but the name was enough. She folded the paper neatly and placed it back on the counter. Her smile didn't reach her eyes that day. Later that night, she found herself walking the coastline. The tide was low, the moon faint behind thin clouds. She whispered an apology to the sea. She didn't know to whom. Then one morning, a stranger walked into the bakery, tall with ink-stained fingers and a quiet voice. He introduced himself as Jonas, the new owner of the used bookstore around the corner. May greeted him with a discount croissant and stories about her hip replacement. He laughed softly like it surprised him. Elara stood in the background, flower on her forearms, eyes cautious. But Jonas just nodded at her politely. No recognition. No flicker of that look the one people gave her after the news broke. She felt her guard ease, just a little. Days turned into weeks. Jonas began stopping by more often, sometimes for bread, sometimes just for warmth. He and Elara began trading silent glances. Then words. "You always work mornings?" he asked once, handing over a crumpled $10 bill. She shrugged. "I like to start early." "Me too," he said. "Quiet's nice." They didn't speak of more than pastries and weather for a while. But in silence, a kind of comfort grew. One afternoon, while stocking jam jars, May spoke casually. "You like him, don't you?" Elara nearly dropped a jar. "Who?" May grinned, flour on her cheek. "Don't be coy. That bookstore boy." Elara smiled, but it faded fast. "Even if I did," she said quietly, "some things follow you." May looked at her, really looked. "You're running from something," she said. "But even silence has an expiration date, dear." Elara didn't answer. But that night she stood outside the bookstore for 5 minutes before walking away. The next morning a letter waited at the bakery. No name, just a return address from the city hospital. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside, a single sentence. "We are reopening the internal investigation into the events of February 12th. No apology, no explanation, just a ripple in the quiet she'd fought so hard to build. Elara stared at the letter for a long time. Its edges had curled slightly in the coastal humidity, but the typeface was unmistakably sharp. Clinical. The kind of font that made statements sound like orders. She folded it once, then again, and tucked it under the bread slicer where May wouldn't find it. That day she worked without speaking much. Even the sourdough loaves came out uneven. The letter didn't say why the investigation had been reopened, but Elara could guess. Whispers traveled fast in institutions like that. Maybe a new administrator. Maybe someone in IT stumbled across a corrupted file and wondered, what if it wasn't corrupted? She didn't want to care. But something about those words, reopening the investigation, unlocked a door inside her she thought she'd sealed. That night she walked the cliffs again. Watched the water gnaw at the rocks like time itself, trying to erase everything. She thought about Harold Gauss, his wife, sobbing in the hallway, the way her supervisor's lips had thinned when Elara tried to explain what she'd seen on the monitor, and the silence that followed. Not just hers, everyone's. Jonas noticed something had changed. He didn't ask. Not at first. He just started bringing her coffee in the mornings. Never said he was doing it on purpose. "I figured bakers needed caffeine too," he said with a quiet grin. She smiled even though the coffee was lukewarm. "You're right," she replied. "We do?" And just like that, a rhythm formed between them. Elara started visiting the bookstore after her shifts. The bell above the door had a lopsided jingle, and the place smelled like cedar and mildew and sun-warmed paper. Jonas spent most afternoons with a pencil behind one ear and an open book in his lap. But when she walked in, he'd put it down without hesitation. They talked about small things. Favorite words, least favorite endings, the smell of ink. "You know," he said once, "pulling a battered poetry book off the shelf, you carry yourself like someone who used to love the world more than she does now." She didn't flinch. She just whispered, "That's not inaccurate." Over time, the past loosened its grip just a little, until the day the second letter arrived. This time, it wasn't from the hospital. It was from a journalist. "I believe you were not responsible for Harold Gauss's death," it began. "I've seen something. Please, contact me." Attached was a grainy, still image. A paused video frame. Elara's blood went cold. In the frame, she was standing at Harold's bedside. Beside her, just barely in view, was Dr. Keene reaching toward the IV bag. It was dated 10 minutes before the crash. The cameras had been working. Someone had lied. Her hands trembled as she held the printout. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. She didn't realize May had come into the room until she felt a warm hand on her shoulder. "Bad news?" May asked gently. Elara hesitated, then nodded. "Old news, maybe. Just coming back." May didn't press, just gave her a knowing look. "Some truths don't stay buried, dear," she said, "even if you're not the one digging." Elara didn't sleep that night. She kept seeing Keene's hand. He'd administered the dose. She remembered it now, foggy but present. He'd insisted Harold needed extra sedation for rest. She had hesitated but said nothing. She hadn't been certain, and certainty was dangerous in that place. You didn't accuse doctors unless you had proof. And then the footage disappeared, and she stayed quiet. Maybe because she feared being wrong, or because she feared being right. She typed an email to the journalist, deleted it, typed it again, then left it unsent. The next morning she showed up at the bookstore earlier than usual. Jonas looked up from the register. "Did you sleep?" he asked, already knowing the answer. She shook her head. "I need to tell you something." They sat between the poetry section and the local history books. She told him everything. From the moment Harold's heart stopped to the moment her supervisor told her to let the doctors handle the narrative. Jonas didn't interrupt, not even once. He didn't look shocked or disgusted, just heartbroken. "You didn't say anything," he said softly. "No," she whispered. "I let them bury it. I let them bury me with it." He leaned forward. "You didn't bury anything. You just didn't fight. And maybe that's what surviving looked like back then." She blinked, startled by the compassion in his voice. "Do you think I should go back?" "I think," Jonas said slowly, "that if you do, it should be for you, not for them." 2 days later, the footage was leaked. Not just to the journalist, but to the public. The full clip, unedited, uncut. It spread fast, and it was undeniable. Keene had changed the IV dosage. Elara had stood back uncertain. She'd asked a question that was waved off, and 10 minutes later, Harold Gauss was gone. The hospital released a statement. "We regret the oversight in our original internal findings. Nurse Elara Voss acted in accordance with protocol and raised timely concerns. We extend a formal apology." It trended for less than a day, but her inbox exploded. Former colleagues, former classmates, people who'd once ghosted her now filling her screen with, "I'm so sorry, and I always believed you, and please, come back." Even Dr. Keene emailed a hollow apology. No ownership, just words strung together by lawyers. She didn't reply. Instead, she walked to the bookstore that afternoon and handed Jonas her phone. "Read them," she said. He did. When he looked up, she asked, "What would you do?" He gave her a long, quiet look. Then, "Depends what you're looking for. Justice or peace?" She nodded slowly, then walked out the door into the setting sun. Elara didn't answer the hospital's emails, not the calls either. They kept coming one after another, some warm, some desperate, some clearly written by PR teams trying to mitigate damage. She let them pile up unread, at first out of spite, then simply because she had nothing left to say to any of them. May found her at the bakery freezer one morning, just standing there staring at the frost-covered shelves. "You're not sleeping again," she said, voice soft. Elara blinked. "Not much." May crossed her arms. "It's not weakness to go back and speak your truth, you know." Elara turned. "I already did, just not when it mattered most." May looked at her for a long time, then reached up, brushing some flour from Elara's sleeve. Maybe now is when it matters. She didn't plan to go back, but sometimes closure isn't planned. It started with a voicemail, one she didn't mean to listen to. "Hi, Elara. This is Daniel, Harold Gauss's son." Her hand froze over the pause button. "I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you, but I saw the footage, and I can't stop thinking about the way you were treated. I believed them. I believed him, and I'm sorry." Silence. Then, "If you ever want to talk about him, or about anything, you've got my number now." Elara sat on the porch of May's bakery that evening, watching the sky dim into a soft watercolor of purples and pinks. Jonas joined her holding 2 mugs of weak coffee. She handed him her phone. He listened to the voicemail in full, then handed it back without a word. "I think I have to go," she said. Jonas sipped his coffee. "Just for a visit. Just for some air," she murmured, "and maybe to look them in the eye." 2 days later, she boarded a bus. She wore plain clothes, no badge, no white shoes, just herself. The city hadn't changed, but her reflection in the hospital windows had. Inside, the corridors still smelled like antiseptic and lemon cleaner, but she didn't feel at home anymore. Dr. Keene wasn't there. He'd been placed on extended leave, according to the receptionist, pending disciplinary review. Her old supervisor spotted her from across the lobby. "Elara," she breathed, stepping forward like a memory brought to life. "You came." Elara nodded, polite but distant. "Not to stay." There was a pause. I'm sorry, her supervisor said finally. For everything. Alara met her eyes. No, she said gently. You're sorry now. She didn't go up to the ICU. She didn't walk the halls of ghosts. Instead, she met with Daniel Gauss in a small cafe across the street. He looked older than his press photos, more tired, more real. I kept wondering, he said after a long silence, what it must have felt like. To be blamed. To be erased. She stirred her tea slowly. It was quiet, she said, but not peaceful. Daniel looked away, jaw tight. My father. He trusted the hospital. We did too. I thought they were protecting the truth, but they were just protecting themselves. Alara nodded. It happens more often than you'd think. They sat in silence for a long moment. The city moved outside the window, oblivious. I wish I'd known you back then, Daniel said. She offered a small smile. Back then, I didn't know me either. After the meeting, she visited her old apartment building. Her name was still scratched into the call box, but someone else answered now. She didn't press the buzzer. Instead, she walked one final loop around the block, past the bus stop, past the coffee shop where she used to write chart notes on napkins between shifts. Every corner held echoes, every step a reminder. She didn't belong here anymore. She was no longer a nurse in this place. She was a memory. When she returned to the coastal town, the ocean greeted her like an old friend. May hugged her tightly, then swatted her on the arm for worrying an old woman. Jonas didn't say anything. He just handed her a novel he'd been saving. Thought you might need this, he said. It's about starting over. She flipped through the first few pages, then looked up. Did they call while I was gone? He nodded. Twice. Sounded like they were offering you something. Alara sighed. I bet they are. The official offer arrived in the mail 2 days later. Full reinstatement, back pay, public commendation, optional interview with the board. And one final line, we'd be honored to have you return to our team. She stared at it, folded it once, then set it aside. Jonas found her at the edge of the cliff trail that evening. You gonna take it? He asked. I thought about it. And now, she looked out over the water. The tide was rolling in quiet but persistent. I think I want something that doesn't ask me to survive anymore. Something that lets me heal. Jonas watched her in silence. Then, what will you do? Alara smiled softly. I'm going to open a place of my own. It started small, just a sketch on napkin paper, a few rooms, a shared garden, a space for people who needed care without shame, a place where stories weren't buried. A month later, she signed the lease on an old, weather-beaten house at the edge of the town. It had cracked windows, a sagging roof, and a view of the sea. She called it Harbor Light. Not a hospital, not a clinic, just care. On her terms. The townsfolk were curious at first. They saw the sign Harbor Light Wellness and Recovery Center and peeked through the windows as renovations began. Some asked if it was a spa. Others assumed it was a retirement home. Alara didn't correct them. Not because she didn't care, but because the truth took time to explain. She was building something different, a place where people could be cared for without being rushed labeled or handed clipboards faster than compassion. The first person to walk through the doors wasn't a patient. It was May, carrying a tray of scones and 2 mismatched mugs. Grand openings should always have snacks, she said. Alara laughed a sound that caught her off guard. She was still learning how to laugh without guilt. Jonas was next. He arrived with a battered bookshelf, a stack of gently used novels, and a small brass bell he'd polished just for the entryway. You'll need a welcome sound, he said. Something that says peace lives here. She hung it herself just above the threshold. It chimed softly in the sea breeze. Over the next few weeks, Harbor Light began to breathe. A young mother recovering from postpartum exhaustion came for a few hours of rest and quiet. A widower dropped by once a week to sit in the garden and read, just to be near people without having to speak. Alara didn't wear scrubs, no name tag. She offered tea. Gentle conversation. Sometimes just presence. Word spread slowly as things did in the town. But it spread. One morning, a woman in her 60s stood at the door hesitating. She introduced herself as Nadine, a former nurse who'd retired early after a breakdown. She'd heard of Alara's story, and had driven nearly 2 hours just to see if it was true. Is this really your place? Nadine asked, eyes skeptical and tender at once. Alara nodded. And people just come here? They do, she said softly. And they're welcome to leave too. Nadine stood quietly, then sat in the nearest chair and began to cry. Elara didn't offer tissues, not right away, she just sat beside her. And they cried together, but not everyone welcomed Harbour Light. One afternoon, a stern man in a crisp button-down entered. He introduced himself as Edward Mallon from the County Health Office. He inspected the premises, taking notes. Unlicensed wellness centres are a regulatory grey area, he said, especially ones run by individuals with unresolved professional histories. Elara kept her tone even. I'm not practicing medicine. I'm offering space. Mallon sniffed. You're still using your reputation to attract vulnerable individuals. That night she stared at the wall for hours, wondering if peace would always be borrowed time. Jonas found her sitting on the back steps. I tried to build something that couldn't be taken away, she said. Jonas crouched beside her. Then fight for it. But only if it's still what you want. Elara looked at the garden, the hummingbird feeder, the chalk drawings from the neighborhood kids. It was what she wanted, and maybe that mattered more than permission. The next morning, she filed paperwork to classify Harbour Light as a community support cooperative. No formal treatments, just wellness, just presence. When the letter of approval arrived, she held it to her chest like a heartbeat. Nadine became a regular fixture. She volunteered on Thursdays, serving soup and telling stories from her own nursing days. May baked in bulk now. Jonas taught journaling workshops on Sunday mornings. And Elara, she healed, not all at once, but in pieces. Some days she still woke with a phantom panic, hearing the monitor's flatline in her dreams. Other days she walked barefoot in the dewy grass at dawn and felt nothing but the softness of earth. One particular evening, as the sun sank low, Daniel Gauss arrived. He had emailed the week before, asking carefully if he could visit. She hadn't replied, but he came anyway. He stood awkwardly in the entrance, hands in his pockets. I don't want anything, he said. I just wanted to see what you built. Elara led him through the garden, past the wind chimes and the herb planters. He paused at the porch steps. My father, he wouldn't have understood this place, he said, but I think my mother would have loved it. Elara smiled gently. That's more than most people get. They sat in silence for a while. Then he left without asking for forgiveness, and she didn't need him to. That night, Jonas cooked. He wasn't good at it, burned the onions, and forgot the salt, but he tried. They sat on the porch steps, feet dangling in the cool dusk. I never asked what you'd do if this place didn't work, he said, sipping wine from a mason jar. I didn't plan for that, Elara replied. You always have a plan. Not anymore. They looked at each other. He reached out slowly, took her hand. She didn't pull away. Later, after the stars came out, she stood alone at the edge of the garden. A breeze passed through the trees, rustling leaves like whispered names. She thought of Harold Gauss, of every patient, every silence, every moment she had let something pass her by just to survive. This place was not redemption. It was reclamation, not of her career, but of herself. Winter arrived gently in the coastal town, brushing the rooftops with frost and quiet. At Harbour Light, the pace slowed with the season. Fewer drop-ins, more tea, softer voices. Elara didn't mind. Peace didn't have to be loud. One crisp morning she stood in the kitchen, with May peeling apples for a tart. Sunlight poured through the windows, warming the tile floor. May's hands, slower now, still moved with purpose. You know, May said, squinting at a crooked slice, I wasn't sure what to make of you when you arrived. Elara smiled. Most people aren't. May shrugged. Thought you were one of those quiet types with too many ghosts and no manners. And now I know you're one of those quiet types with too many ghosts and damn good manners. She chuckled. And a better pie crust than I'll ever make. Elara laughed softly, brushing flour from her sweater. The ghosts hadn't left, but they'd grown quieter too. Less menacing, more like old companions who occasionally tapped her shoulder just to say, remember. Harbour Light's rhythm had become its own kind of medicine. Each week had its moments. A grief group on Mondays, story circle Wednesdays, open art on Saturdays for the local teens, some of whom didn't say a word, just painted until dusk. And every day someone new showed up, sometimes with visible wounds, other times with ones harder to name. Elara learned to listen without trying to fix. She'd once thought nursing meant solving things. Now she knew some pain just needed company. One chilly afternoon, Jonas brought her a book with a red ribbon tied around it. No occasion, he said, except maybe page 72. She raised an eyebrow. When she flipped to it, she found his handwriting in the margin. Healing doesn't mean erasing, it means rewriting. She looked up. He was already turning away, pretending to browse the gardening section. She closed the book with a smile. Then came the day Elara received the letter she never expected. From the hospital. Again. But this one wasn't from administration. Not PR. Not legal. It was handwritten. The ink shaky but deliberate. Dear Elara, you don't know me, but I am the new chief of nursing. I've reviewed your case in full. I watched the footage twice. I've seen the silence left in your wake. What happened to you was not just a mistake. It was a failure of courage, of character, of care. We are not the same hospital anymore. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do hope that someday we might be worthy of it. Elara read it twice, then placed it gently in the drawer with Jonas's note and her original license still unrenewed. She never responded. But that night she added a new entry to Harbour Light's visitor journal. Forgiveness isn't for them, it's for me. And today I choose it. Spring returned with wildflowers along the coast and laughter from children who used the garden as a playground more than a sanctuary. May's knees gave out more often, so Elara taught herself how to make her favorite molasses bread, adjusting the recipe until it was close enough to count. Jonas began leading a local book club that met in Harbour Light's sunroom. Even Nadine, once too fragile to speak above a whisper, hosted a Q&A for retired healthcare workers, helping them process what they'd carried home each day for years. The center didn't just serve people anymore, it grew them. Then, one evening as soft rain began tapping the windows, Jonas found Elara watching the sea. You ever wonder? He asked what you'd be doing if none of it had happened. She considered the question. I used to, but not lately. He nodded. Why not? She smiled faintly. Because if none of it had happened, I might still think silence is noble. That surviving was enough. He leaned against the doorway beside her. And now, she said, turning to him, I know there's more than surviving. There's choosing. There's becoming. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Do you ever wish it had ended differently? Elara shook her head slowly. No, she whispered. Not anymore. The seasons passed. The garden bloomed and faded and bloomed again. Elara began humming again without realizing. Sometimes a new visitor would hear her and pause. You were a nurse, weren't you, they'd ask. She'd nod. But that was all. She no longer needed to explain the rest. One night after everyone had gone home and the wind stirred gently through the olive trees, she opened the journal at Harbour Light's front desk. There, in fresh handwriting, this place saved me. Not by fixing me, but by letting me feel human again. Thank you. Elara closed the journal with care, walked to the porch, and sat there barefoot, listening to the world breathe. Not cured, not erased, but whole and quietly, gloriously free. Sometimes healing isn't loud. It doesn't come from courtroom victories or public vindication. Sometimes it comes in a cup of tea, a shared silence, a place where no one knows your name, but they see you anyway. What does peace look like for you? And what would you walk away from to finally feel whole? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved, you consider liking, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Thanks for staying until the end. We'll see you in the next one.